Hi, welcome to Public Access. Today, we're going to be talking about anti-Semitism. We've talked a lot on this show about the current conflict in Palestine, both looking at its protests and speaking with the New Mexico Holocaust Museum on how to best approach these conversations. Today, I want to talk about how anti-Semitism affects community members, both Jewish and non-Jewish, how it's weaponized against people, and how it hurts people. Today, speaking with me on this issue is Alan from Jewish Voice for Peace. Jewish Voice for Peace is a US-based organization that stands up for humanitarian rights in Israel and Palestine. And I would like to know a little bit better how to approach this conversation myself. Thank you for joining me, Alan.
Thank you.
I reached out to you and your organization because, as you can imagine, someone who I want to speak on this subject. This is a really tough subject, but I feel wholly inadequate to know how to approach it. I mean, it is really a hard thing to talk about anti-Semitism. So, I mean, I just kind of want to come out straight. What is anti-Semitism to you?
Well, some people take it to mean hatred of Middle Eastern people, because Middle Eastern languages are Semitic. But really what I'm thinking we're talking about today is the use of the word as it came up in Germany in the 19th century. And it was invented there to be a polite way to say Jew hatred.
So it actually started as almost a good thing on the part of the Germans. That was a polite way
No, it started as a euphemism.
Interesting, but that's how they describe their own hatred without just saying Jew hatred.
Right. They wanted to soften what what they were doing.
Wow.
They didn't want to stop hating Jews. They just didn't want to say quite as explicitly that they were hating Jews.
Well, we're already off to an interesting start. I didn't know that was the origin. I mean, I know it's kind of often been construed. It's, you think of the Semitic peoples, and I feel like often that original meaning, especially right now in our current media, it's been completely changed and warped. But I especially didn't know it came from the Germans in order to better describe their hatred because they wanted to
More politely describe their hatred.
More politely describe their hatred. So, in the modern context, how do you see anti-Semitism in our world today?
Jew hatred.
And do you see a lot of it in our society and kind of in the global diaspora?
In the United States, it's there. I personally will have, and now I occasionally encounter people who say anti-Semitic things, and I'm going to use it in the sense of Jew hatred. Hatred of Jews because they are Jews. Or because of some characteristic that they stereotype that they ascribe to all Jews. All Jews are.
Anytime
even
you
if
start
it's
there.
even if it's a positive attribute. All Jews are smart. All Jews are good with money. All Jews are good at business. May be said in a context where they think that they're complimenting you, assuming that because you're Jewish, you are good at such and such. Where it's a generalization, and it doesn't, and that's anti-Semitic.
So it kind of seems like the center of anti-Semitism just comes from a unwillingness to look at Jewish people as individuals and more as a collective. Am I kind of right in that? And,
Yes.
And then describing, of course, your own biases, your opinions about them, and whatever way that is to an entire
Right.
community. I think you really interest me in this conversation because Jewish Voice for Peace has been around a lot. I mean, we actually got to speak with them just a tiny bit, one of their members. They didn't say they were a member, but in our we did documentary, we went to a Palestine protest, and we met Jewish people there who were protesting what is currently going on in Gaza. And that was a real wake-up call for me because I realized that dividing line isn't nearly as thick as I thought it was. And that's when I started to understand there is currently an incredible conversation within the Jewish community on what this anti-Semitism is, and it's very much bleeding over into our politics, our media, And I think you personally have been affected this in quite a negative way. I mean, so you've experienced anti-Semitism in your own life, but you've also experienced kind of this reversal of it where now it's being used against you because of the way you speak about Palestine. Help me understand that a bit.
Okay. Well, first, and I don't mean to be insulting.
No, please, correct me.
yeah,
I need to be
yeah,
corrected in this
yeah.
conversation. That's why we're having
The
it.
assumption, you're surprised at the number of Jews who were at UNM protesting what's happening in Gaza.
And it was a surprise to me.
Is based on the assumption that all Jews are supporters of Israel.
And you wanted to make that point really quickly. I understand that that is in itself an anti-Semitic thought just to walk in with, that all Jews are.
All Jews are. It doesn't matter what you. It doesn't matter what comes after that.
Anytime you just say all Jews are something.
All Jews are.
So I shouldn't be surprised at that at all.
All Jews are, right? And it's a common assumption. In fact, one of the missions of Jewish Voice for Peace, which I'll refer to as JVP, one of the missions of JVP is to dispel the idea that Jews are a monolith about anything, and especially about that. But I'll be even stronger. And I will say this, that to assume that because one is Jewish, one inherently favors a regime that systematically discriminates against, dispossesses, displaces, and right now especially kills with impunity other people. To assume that all Jews support that as a core element of being Jewish, can you see how profoundly insulting that is?
I do, and especially because I'm someone who myself, I find to find that kind of action abhorrent. Currently, the International Criminal Court has arrest warrants for Netanyahu and some of his cabinet, and they've recently ruled that their settlements in the West Bank and their evictions in East Jerusalem are considered apartheid. In our particular country doesn't recognize those courts or those decisions. But hopefully you can understand maybe how I came to this problem, because I would say there is a significant amount of the pro-Israeli community that wants to make that point very clear, that anything against anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. In fact, that is something our Congress has recently passed. How does that make you feel?
On one level, angry. On another level, I don't want to say happy, but the fact is, the accusations of anti-Semitism because you're opposed to the nature of an ethno-religious, ethno-theocratic state. It's always been, I think it's probably always been called anti-Semitic, but the extent to which they have to push that idea that it is an indication that they're afraid of the idea, and they're only afraid of the idea because it's spreading. You know, there's a saying that's, some places on the web say it's misattributed to Gandhi, but it's often attributed to Gandhi. It says, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Well, we've been through the first they ignore you, then they laugh at you. And the fact that they're feeling that they have to push resolutions through Congress, and which Melanie Stansbury voted for. By the way, the entire House Democratic leadership voted present, and Melanie Stansbury voted aye.
What does that say to you? How do you interpret that?
I interpret that as Melanie Stansbury is afraid of being targeted with accusations of being anti-Semitic or being insufficiently favorable to Israel.
So
I don't think that she thinks that I'm an anti-Semite because I'm opposed to an Islamic ethno-theocratic state or a Christian ethno-theocratic state or a Jewish ethno-theocratic state.
I mean,
I don't think she would hear that and say I'm an anti-Semite, but
she voted for that.
she's afraid of of the people who are pushing that.
I mean, I have to say, I mean, it does feel a little ridiculous to be in conversation with you and for someone to call you an anti-Semite. I mean, that has to just be a really jarring emotion. I mean, I can't imagine what that's like.
Well, you get used to it, and after a while, you get sort of proud of it. You know, it becomes a choice between accepting that you're going to be called an anti-Semite by people who are defending the indefensible, just by acting in a way that allows me to look in the mirror.
I mean, what if you say that, you know, you're somewhat proud of it? So, I mean, this seems to be an area of conflict that you get a lot. I mean, so you're pretty active within your own synagogue community. You've been a treasurer for your synagogue before. You've been a leader of your community in there. I mean, is this something that you are confronting on a regular basis? What's your experience been there?
Yeah, there's you know, I mean, Nahalat Shalom is about the only congregation in Albuquerque that will accept you as a member no matter what your views are on Israel-Palestine.
That's how prevalent it is that you cannot be a member of other synagogue communities in this town because of this stance that you take.
Let's just say that there are I hear of scattered people who belong to other congregations who are anti-Zionist, but they're not, I don't think they're open about it. You know, there's really a prevalent view of, you know, it's like they're feeling odd person out.
Well, I mean, that has to be kind of difficult because, I mean, I have to say I have seen in the community that I have been able to be a part of the protest community, I have seen people come in that I think do to some extent hold anti-Semitic beliefs. So I know that they're out there. I know that there are people who are very capable of just hating someone based on the position of Jewishness. And I think what's weird to me is it seems like that would hurt your cause. If you're trying to be aware of hatred towards your people, it seems that starting to point that cannon inwards would almost have the opposite effect and arm the very people you're trying to make sure are exposed as being hateful.
I have at times been either a speaker at an event or a moderator at an event and had somebody stand up and make remarks that somebody who was critical of Israel stand up and make remarks that I thought anti-Semitic, and I don't let it pass. Even if I'm in the audience, I'll raise my hand and speak up. And it's not acceptable no matter where it comes from. In anti-Zionist circles or Israel critical circles, it is usually the accusation that Jews control everything, that AIPAC runs the country, that the U.S. is Israel's servant, and that's the usual. There's Allison Weir. I haven't heard much from her lately, but she had an organization called If Americans Knew, and it was anti-Zionist. But her basic thesis was that if Americans knew what Israel was doing Americans would demand that the U.S. stop supporting Israel. And the problem there is, can I make reference if people want to look up something?
Oh, absolutely, please.
If people want to Google Common Dreams Wagman, W-A-G-M-A-N, aircraft carrier. It's a piece I wrote in Common Dreams where I describe in detail how, in fact, the U.S. supports Israel because Israel serves U.S. national security needs, the U.S. international purposes. In there, I point out, for example, that for several months, the Republicans in Congress held up funding for Israeli weapons and for weapons for Ukraine. But only Ukraine was running out of weapons. And the reason Israel wasn't running out of bombs was because Israel allows the U.S. to store billions of dollars worth of bombs and ammunition in Israel for the U.S. military to use in some prospective future conflict in the Middle East. Israel gets away with, the U.S. doesn't stop Israel from doing what it does because Israel is extremely useful to the U.S. And Biden didn't have to ask for more money for bombs for Israel.
They were already there.
They were there. He just opened the warehouse and let the Israelis come in and take them. Biden in 1986 on the floor of the Senate gave a speech and talked about how useful Israel was to the United States and said, this is like word for word, if Israel didn't exist, the United States would have to invent it. It is not Israel controlling the U.S. It is not Jews dictating U.S. policy. When U.S. perceived its national interest to be other than what Israel wanted, the U.S. didn't do what Israel wanted. When in the 80s, when the U.S. wanted to sell AWACS, surveillance planes, to the Saudis, Israel opposed it. But the Reagan and Bush administrations wanted to sell them. They sold them. Netanyahu was adamant against the Iran nuclear deal, but the U.S. saw the Iran nuclear deal as being in its interests, and so the hell with Israel. When Israel is not contradicting U.S. interests, it can get away with pretty much anything it wants because it serves the United States. And yet the anti-Semitic view is Israel gets to do whatever it wants because Israel controls the United States. I'm not saying that AIPAC and other heavy Jewish funders don't have a lot of influence, but when it comes down to what the U.S. considers its national interests, the U.S. follows its national interests. Alison Weir was saying if the U.S. government knew what Israel was doing, they'd stop giving it money. Nah, the U.S. government is giving Israel money because it knows what Israel is doing. Israel sends arms to dictators. In '84, I traveled through the war zone in Guatemala, and in '86, I went back and did human rights work, protecting human rights activists in Guatemala. And every Guatemalan soldier that was killing tens and hundreds of thousands of Mayans in Guatemala was carrying an Israeli rifle. They traveled with Israeli advisors. I saw children who saw me and became terrified and later learned the reason they were scared was because they thought I was Israeli. Come to show Guatemalan troops which people to disappear.
And that's not something uncommon either, I understand, which is that there have been many times in Israeli policy when America wanted to do something, whether it was those Guatemalan death squads or, say, the apartheid regime in South Africa, that Israel has always been available to train, to give information, technology, weapons, in order to help the U.S. in whatever that goal may be.
Yeah, whatever the U.S. wanted done but couldn't do itself, Israel's there to do it. Israel was a useful tool.
So And maybe that's kind of why this entire conflict is so strange to me, is because, I am dealing with a lot of people who would like to think that this is an Israeli-controlled system they have, but I can't tell if our politicians really want the slaughter in Gaza to stop, because if we are in fact the ones buying Israel, I feel like either we don't have as much leverage as maybe we thought of over them, or that there actually is just an incredible amount of acceptance that this is what's going to be happening in Gaza, and we're going to let Israel do it. I mean, how do you kind of feel about that? I mean, do you feel like we're either struggling to get Israel to stop this kind of slaughter, or do you think it's more them kind of just being in the exact same page with Israel?
I think American politicians are horrified at what they're seeing, but they're also aware of how useful Israel is for American purposes. The U.S. this is a very public slaughter over a short period of time with what are obviously U.S.-funded weapons, and so it creates kind of a different situation than the 130,000, 140,000 people in Guatemala that were killed with U.S. support, the tens of thousands of people that were killed in El Salvador with U.S. support, the tens of thousands of people that were killed in Nicaragua with U.S. support, the torturing and the overthrow of governments in the Middle East and South America with CIA and U.S. support. This just happens to be more visible and done by somebody that is more overtly useful, and I can't say. Well, you look at Melanie Stansbury's vote against what I'm sure she knew to be truth. That she doesn't want. Nobody wants to be accused of being anti-Semitic, and when you can propagate the myth that all Jews support Israel and therefore to criticize Israel or make Israel stop doing what it's doing or to call Israel what it is to actually be attacking Jews as Jews, which is what the Anti-Defamation League wants you to believe, which is what AIPAC wants you to believe, which is what the American Jewish Congress wants you to believe, what a lot of mainstream Jewish organizations with very good PR operations want people to believe. They had you believing it.
They did. They absolutely
They had
did.
they have casual observers believing it, and that's their intent.
Well, I'd like to know then a bit more how your own faith has kind of helped interpret your surroundings, how you kind of come to some of these conclusions, because as an outsider, I'm often kind of lost in how do you even approach a conflict like this that is so old, that has a lot of people who have a lot of deep feelings. I mean, does your faith really help inform you in your stance here, or is this more of even just something that you've come because of some of maybe Western idealism against, like you said, you don't like the idea of a racist state that says this is the primary race or religion of our state. These kind of things don't jive with you. I'm curious if your faith helps influence that at all.
Yes, absolutely. But the Jewish religious tradition is 3,500 years old.
Give or take.
Give or take. 3,527 years and 6 months now.
It's been a while.
Yeah. Now, ever since, and the Romans expelled certainly all the elites, most of the Jewish elites in, I think it was 138 CE. and there was just sort of a rump population left. For almost 2,000 years, Jews could, for most of that time, not all the time, most of the time, could more or less have gone back at any time. Some did, very few relatively. Most didn't. It was not part of the temple. The temple was destroyed in 70 CE. The Jews were dispersed in 138 CE after a revolution against Rome, and the Romans said, "Oh, the hell with these people." But even before the expulsion, the main center of Jewish learning and thought was in Babylon. So the temple was in Jerusalem, but Babylon was New York. And the Babylonians looked down on the people, Babylonian Jews looked down on Israel. And there was a temple in Egypt, in Elephantine in Egypt. There was not this part of the Jewish religion that said we are impelled, we are ordered to go back to Palestine.
In some way, you view the expulsion from Jerusalem, from Palestine, as kind of being the story of the Jewish people, and you think it's almost, if I'm interpreting you right, that it's a kind of newer idea to say this Jewish right to return. I mean, that's a newer idea in your mind? That's not come from your faith, but come from people with goals and ideals.
Yeah, I mean, Zionism. Christian Zionism was born in the mid-19th century in this country. Jewish Zionism was born in Austria in the early 1880s. So we're talking 140 years, which is why I raised the fact that this is a 3,500-year-old tradition. And Zionism, the belief in the imperative to go to Palestine and create a Jewish state, is 140 years old. It was a secular movement. It wasn't a religious movement.
What does that mean in terms of its secularism?
They weren't religious. The early Zionists were by and large mostly not religious Jews. They didn't feel a religious calling to go back to the Holy Land and create, build a temple. The religious Jews, the Orthodox and Reform in particular, which were the two main at the time, both said Judaism is a religion, it's not a nationality. We don't support this idea of a nation. And Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews were opposed to Zionism. And that opposition remained pretty strong until the Holocaust, which kind of
spurred that conversation.
Which kind of flipped things. But Zionism was not a religious movement. It was not part of the Jewish religion. And I'm going to get in trouble with this, but I'll say it. I think to a certain extent, the extent to which the uncritical devotion to Israel has taken over at least some Jewish religious observance. I think people have to watch out that they're not engaging in idolatry.
That might make sense, actually, though. I mean, if you have this concept that says, I want to go build a nation somewhere else, it's my right to go get this land, expel local populations, build up my population, build up a nation. That's very much nation building. That's, I mean, reading through, the Old Testament, there is some very specific instructions for some people to build nation building, but it doesn't seem to give you exactly the rule book on how to do it every time. And it seems like what motivated people were these newer 20th century, 19th century concepts of nation building. So what's really interesting to me then is...
I want to
Sure.
interrupt and make a point too.
Yeah.
In, I think, 1902, Theodor Herzl, who is the founder, the figurehead founder of the modern Zionist movement, he wrote a letter to, he was expecting, Palestine was under control of the Ottoman Empire at the time, but Herzl was expecting the Brits to take over eventually. And he wrote a letter to the British Minister for Colonial Affairs, Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, people my age remember that Zimbabwe used to be called Rhodesia. It was an apartheid state, just like South Africa. So Cecil Rhodes was a racist apartheid Brit, and Theodor Herzl wrote to Cecil Rhodes saying, this is a colonial project that we're entitled. I'm writing to you because we are engaged in a colonial project, and you should ally with us because we are building a European colony in Palestine. And in 1896, in his book Der Judenstaat, Herzl wrote that he envisioned a Jewish colony in Palestine would be an outpost of European civilization, a wall of defense against barbarism.
I know it's funny you bring it back to Herzl, because I think for me what really started to change my mind about the way Israel came about was when I read the early Zionist writings. It struck me very much because, I mean, I have an understanding of why someone might feel that there is a religious tradition that can bring you back. You know, for me, what's been really interesting is understanding that there are traditions here in America with a lot of the indigenous people who have a tradition that says they are part of that land. And I would absolutely say that America has no right to restrict the people who have traditions based on that land to return to them. I mean, do you feel to some extent the same way about the Jewish people returning to Israel? Or, I mean, is that kind of disconnected from the idea of we can return to Israel, but we can also build the Israel state and make it look the way we want to and make it look like a Jewish state?
I went to Israel once in 2002. At the time, I was what is now called a liberal Zionist. I believed in the necessity of a Jewish state. I was opposed to the oppression of Palestinians. I wanted a two-state solution. I'm not there anymore, but I was then.
So where are you a bit more now?
Well, let me finish this.
So, yeah, sure, yeah.
When I got off the plane, I started crying.
Coming back here?
No.
Just
when I
arriving?
Landed in Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv and got off the plane on the ground, and I started crying because I was home. This is in the stories that my culture told me. This was my homeland. Now, I have very different politics today. If I were to go back to Israel today and get off a plane at Ben Gurion Airport, I probably would start crying again, because that is my historical home. It is my cultural homeland in the stories which formed my identity. But it being my home, from historical home, does not give me any more right to push the people who are living there now out of their homes, to deprive them of rights. In the case of Gaza, to make sure that they never have enough food, or fuel, or electricity, or water. I'm sorry. The fact that my history started there doesn't give me or anybody else the right to do that.
That has to be pretty hard to watch that keep playing out day by day. I mean, for how, I mean, you're definitely older than I am. For a lot longer, you've watched the Palestinian people be citizens of no state, having no natural born rights to themselves. I mean, that doesn't seem clear to me that that is exactly what the Old Testament calls for, or the Torah. And it doesn't seem clear to me that, you know, the Jewish state law that says that self-determination is exclusively reserved for the Jewish people. I mean, that doesn't seem to be a Jewish idea. That seems to be much more, as you said, an ethnocentric idea. So in this way, do you actually feel like in some right, your ability to return home is threatened by the fact that more nationalistic fervor has taken over the love of that tradition?
I can go back anytime I want.
Sir.
and be minimally questioned. But I have no family there. I have to the best of my knowledge, I have no actual connection with it, except perhaps one from 138 CE, and there's a lot of questions about whether, in fact, I actually have ancestry that is directly tied to the Middle East. I mean, cultures have stories that create societies that make it possible for us to live together. And the stories don't have to be factually true to be real. Okay? The history of Jews coming from Ur of the Chaldees with Abraham. So we didn't even start in Palestine. Mm-hmm. Came in, and then we were in Palestine, we were in Canaan, and then we were in Egypt, and then in the wilderness, and then back in Palestine. Even if I don't come, even if I'm not descended from any of those people, I am in a culture that is created by that story. The story may be the story may not be factual. Doesn't matter if it is or not. It's real.
That's good. I like that a lot, actually. I mean, that was kind of my question to you as well. I mean, when I had is, you know, I mean, I grew up a Christian, so I believed a lot of the same tradition that you did. But now, as I'm older, I've become an atheist, and I have a lot of question about the Exodus, about the David and his armies, about the idea that the creator of the universe brokered land with the people. All of that to me doesn't seem like it's a very real thing. But I understand that if you're Jewish, and especially if you're someone who is a Zionist, that might be a lot to try to contend with. I mean, I imagine that just my own convictions as an atheist might come off as a very anti-Semitic belief that this history that's told isn't, in the factual sense, true. But I think you lay out a really important thing, which is it's not necessarily about if my religion is actually what's at play here. It's that there is a lot more of a deeper connection to the land, and that doesn't give you a right, though, to hurt the people who also are inhabitants to it. I mean, do you feel like in some ways that your own faith has been weaponized against those people?
My faith?
Well, like,
no.
Does it feel like almost two faiths in that regard?
All right, I'm going to tell you my approach to faith, which I'll start with saying faith doesn't have a lot of meaning for me. I try to open myself to experience, and by experience, I mean, I have a contemplative practice, I meditate, I chant. The goal of meditation and chanting is not the meditation itself or the chanting itself. It's to become aware of what's around, to become aware that there are things going on that we don't understand. It's to become aware of energy moving through us, past us, that our boundaries are our physical boundaries are actually very permeable and energy is moving. And so I experience that energy. Faith is believing in something you haven't experienced. But given that the energy is there, I take it as meaning there are things going on beyond us and beyond our understanding. In terms of Jewish scripture, the way I approach it is there were people 2,500, 3,000 years ago who were trying to make sense of what they were seeing. And they had questions and they wrote their answers down. And when we look at Scripture, our job is not to look at Scripture and take it as, oh, this is true. One of the core myths of Judaism is Jacob struggling with the angel, and his name was changed from Yaakov to Yisrael. And Yaakov had to do with, he was grabbing Esau's heel when they came out of the birth canal. But Yisrael means the one who struggles with God. And Judaism is a religion in which you struggle with the text. And what I see as struggling with the text is I look at what this says and I say, they're answering a question. What was the question that they were asking? And if the answer that they came up with 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago seems to me like, no, that doesn't work, then my spiritual job is to figure out what does. And I have two guideposts. One is what's often referred to as the central prayer in Judaism. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Listen, Israel. Hear this, Israel. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And the Hasidic Judaism in the 18th century told us what that means is everything is God. And then the prophet Micah, and God, I think it's chapter 6, verse 8. He says, why do you ask what is expected of you? You've been told. You've been told what God expects of you. And by the way, I hate that word. The God, you said you're an atheist. Yeah. The God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. That's not original with me. But it is to act justly, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. And if I'm looking for what is my answer to what this says in the Torah, in Scripture, if I can't come up with an answer that meets the criteria that everything is God, and I have to act justly, love kindness or mercy, and walk humbly, and I take walking humbly to mean don't ever be so sure you know what justice or kindness is. Don't ever be sure you have the answer. If it doesn't fit with that, then I haven't got the right answer yet, and my struggle is to keep working on it until I figure out the answer. And so all of Scripture is simply a jumping off point for the struggle to recognize that everything is God, so we better be careful. And figure out how do we act justly, love kindness, and walk humbly.
I really like that answer. I mean, I think this is what makes the struggle for me hard to understand. Is I know the history of the 19th and 20th century, the ideas that were created at those times, and I know Scripture enough, but they don't seem to jive in the same way. I mean, exactly how they meet together in this conflict has always been very strange to me. I actually brought a book, if you could help bring that over to me, that I brought that I was hoping to read from and kind of get your ideas about. Thank you. So this book here is actually Jewish Frontier. It's an anthology. It was published originally in 1945. I don't know exactly when this edition came out. And here actually people you've already talked about. There's letters from Herzl, from David Ben-Gurion, early Zionists who really wanted to and these letters are meant to bolster Zionism. They're meant to help encourage that. And this particular one I'm going to read from is someone named Chaim Greenberg. He was actually the editor of this publication of Jewish Frontier. And if you go to Israel today, you can find schools and institutions named after him. Like I said, reading some of the old Zionist texts, it really got me to question what their intentions were. So I wanted to read this passage and just kind of see how you felt about it. I mean, so here this is. U.S. socialists should be the last to claim that formal or physical possession, whether for use or abuse, constitutes a moral title of ownership. You do not recognize the rights of an idle heiress to squander a fortune which she has not earned. Such social outrage seems to you the dark remnant of barbaric economic order. Similarly, no nation has the right to place no trespassing signs around lands which it does not use, soil which goes to waste. The draining of marsh by Jewish pioneer makes more room for Arabs as well as Jews. There is no question of the dispossessing of Palestinian Arabs. So, I mean, here is a very old writing saying that, they have the right to go take this land, that the Arabs have no right to put up this no trespassing sign, and that there's no question that the Arab should be displaced. I mean, you gave a pretty good explanation there of how you bring your faith into that. I mean, how does someone here using this kind of logic to take land, how does that come off to you?
Yeah, it's interesting as 1945 socialism, because in the late 19th, early 20th century, Jewish socialists were organized in organizations called the Bund, and the Bundists basically were socialist, and they were anti-Zionist because they believed that Jews were what they said was socialism is international. And our home is where we live, and we should be working for socialism where we live, and we should not be going to Palestine. We should be fighting for it here. That idea that Mr. Greenberg was expressing, that's basically labor Zionism, and how would it fly here? How would it fly here if a person owned a vacant lot, and that lot was vacant, and the person wasn't using it? Does that give somebody else to come from somewhere else and put a building on it because, well, you weren't using it? What this is rationalization. What we want to do is take it. So here's our rationalization for taking it. I heard that from my parents. That they weren't using it. But more happened than just what Mr. Greenberg had to say. they came in and they took the land. Then they imported Jews to work on the land. And if there were any Palestinians who were there working, they displaced those Palestinians. I mean, he's lying.
Oh yeah, no,
He's lying.
Well, actually, I believe that was even that was written in the 1930s. So that
makes more sense.
So it was right before they even had that opportunity. So
That makes more sense.
It's actually the foreshadowing of hundreds of thousands of Arab Palestinians being displaced. I mean, that's actually what I think is almost so dark about it, is that it is the foreshadowing of catastrophe. I mean, I'd like to know then, if you looking forward, how do you believe, I mean, Israel now does exist and there's no getting around that. How do you think your people have to move forward with your faith? How do you think you help restore some kind of order and justice into that area? Like you said, you can't be so confident to think you know justice. I mean, clearly I think Israelis have it a little wrong right now. What's the next step there?
Okay. I'll put a pin on that for a second, because I want to go back and I want to make sure this interview doesn't end before I talk about what the real threat of anti-Semitism is. Mm-hmm. The real threatening anti-Semitism, because fringe individuals on the left or in the middle or even on the right, if they are fringe individuals, one voice in a crowd, not good, but so what? But there is a huge racist right-wing movement in the United States and around the world. And the root of it is in its racism, and anti-Semitism is woven integrally into it. You remember Charlottesville? Mm-hmm. And you remember what they were chanting?
I actually don't.
Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us.
White people in Charlottesville were really worried about that, huh?
That's the white racist movement, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, Nick Fuentes, Turning Point America, Tucker Carlson. Basically, they're seeing non-white people. White has the definition of white changes all the time.
It's very bendy, that
There was
one.
a time when Jews weren't white. There was a time when Italians weren't white. There was a time when Irish weren't white. But that people, non-white people, are replacing white people. That the non-white population is going to grow and become a majority, and white people will be displaced. But these people believe that non-white people aren't smart enough to do this on their own. They need masterminds to do it. And so you know who the I said, you tell me that you think Jews are smart, and I'm going to tell you that it's anti-Semitic. There's this Jews are smart and devious and are secretly behind immigration and the takeover of the country by non-white people. The non-white people aren't smart enough to do it by themselves, and the Jews are manipulating the situation, and the Jews are running it. Jews will not replace us. You cannot isolate anti-Semitism from other forms of racism and claim to be combating anti-Semitism. They're all tied together. And when you start saying anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, you're protecting a Zionist regime. And I'll say Zionism is the belief in a Jewish state. in a Jewish ethnic state, and right now, ethno-theocratic state. But, and there are Christians United for Israel is just one Christian Zionist organization. There are more members of Christians United for Israel than there are Jews in the United States. So Zionism is not a Jewish phenomenon. The real power in the Zionist movement right now is with Christian Zionism. There's 10, 20, 30 times as many Christian Zionists as there are Jewish Zionists. But back to what happens.
Well, that actually almost answers it to some degree, that maybe the first step is to kind of decouple this idea of anti-Semitism and Zionism, where there actually is the potential to talk about what the people now who live in Israel and Palestine have to do in order to make a non-ethnocentric state. And that has to, I imagine, start with the understanding that anti-Semitism is in fact that kind of racist belief that you have to start putting everyone where they belong. And that definitely feels like somewhat what it's saying, is that the Jewish people belong in that state, and we're going to put them there.
There are white racists who support Israel.
Just to get them out.
No, because Israel is showing how you create an ethno-religious state. They want a white Christian U.S., and Israel is providing the model. They don't like Jews, but they like Israel. But back to the I mean, clearly there's no easy answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no magic wand, unfortunately.
There's no, and right now there is so much pain and anger and resentment and hatred on both sides. It will take, I won't live to see a reconciliation. But I recently heard somebody say, if we're looking for justice, justice is not about settling old scores. It's not about settling accounts.
What's it about?
It's about, and it's not even about if you and I are in conflict. It's not even about you and me figuring out how you and I can live together. It's about you and me figuring out how your kids can live with my kids and your grandchildren can live with my grandchildren. Justice is not about fixing the past. Justice is about finding a future in which we all can live.
And I can't imagine, I mean, watching right now, I mean, this kind of diaspora in the world, it has to be very difficult being in your community. And tomorrow you're going to be making a speech at a synagogue where you'll be talking about currently the relationship that Jewish people see towards yourself, towards the Jewish Voice for Peace, towards this kind of anti-Zionist Jewish movement. If we have any viewers that are Jewish themselves who might not, who even aren't, I mean, who might not understand where you're coming from, that hear what you're saying and feel like you're not really being true to what they believe that their faith influences them on, what would be your advice on how to start reorganizing your thoughts in this way? How do you even start to decouple these ideas and start to approach it new?
Well, I said justice is not about settling accounts. Well, it's not just about settling accounts. You have to be, you can't go forward without being honest about the past. And in the United States, we have not been told the truth about the history of Palestine from the early 19th century forward. We have been basically fed a mythology created by Zionists, by people who were creating a Jewish state in order to justify and get sympathy for the Jewish state. there are Palestinians have known all along what has happened to them. Among Jewish Israeli historians, people, they're not so new anymore, but they're called the new historians. Avi Shleim, Ilan Pape, Tom Segev, that Benny Morris. In the early 1980s, the Israeli government, for whatever reason, opened up a large part of its secret archives about the early history of Zionism and the Jewish state. And these historians began digging into what actually happened. The first one to publish was actually Benny Morris.
And I've read his books. He's got really good books I'd recommend to anyone.
But Benny Morris, when he was first writing and was talking about between 400 and 500 Palestinian villages destroyed and 700,000 Palestinians pushed out. Mm-hmm. And the Jewish myth is that the Arab leaders told the Palestinians to leave and we'll wipe out the Jews and then you can come back, only there's no evidence of anybody ever saying that. Benny Morris was the first one to expose. Israel denied what Palestinians called the Nakba.
Mm-hmm. He was pretty surprised at the history he was writing about.
But he was not only surprised. At the time he was writing it, he thought that Israel hadn't gone far enough. He was of a mind they should have pushed all of them out. The contradiction in Israeli Zionist history is that the split in Zionism from the early 1930s on was between mainstream Zionism or labor Zionism and revisionist Zionism. And mainstream Zionism, headed by Ben-Gurion, basically wanted to quietly push Palestinians out and didn't want to admit that they were doing it and was concerned about world opinion. And they wanted to take part of Palestine. That's why they were ready to, and then later take the rest. Revisionist Zionism, which was founded by Ze'ev Jabotinsky, and Benjamin Netanyahu's father was like a confidant of Jabotinsky, said, the hell with taking part of it now and the rest later. Take it all now and then it won't matter what the world thinks. But while Jabotinsky was much more open about let's just get rid of all the Palestinians, he was in many ways less racist about it. Because you read Jabotinsky's writings and he said, look, the reason we have to just get rid of them all is because they're people. And like any people, they will continue fighting as long as they have any hope of keeping their land. So we have to take all their land and take their hope away. Jabotinsky said they're human beings. And now what we've got is an Israel that calls them human animals.
And I imagine you would say that the way we have to start moving forward is just to acknowledge the human suffering that's happening. And I think that's kind of been the hardest thing for me, is I feel like whenever I find someone who is so dug into whatever side of this they believe, the acknowledgement of human suffering, wherever it is pretty hard to reckon with. And I meet a lot of people who aren't willing to acknowledge that Israel has for decades caused immense suffering to indigenous people. And likewise, I actually do meet people who I think ignore an incredible amount that can happen to Jews living here in America or abroad. And I think it's hard for me because I don't know how to approach that conversation ever. And I think after our conversation, I'm a bit more understanding of where you come from, and hopefully I feel a bit more comfortable.
Right. But let's be clear. The people who live in Israel are by and large as indifferent to because ignorant of the conditions of what their society is doing to Palestinians as white people, however one defines white people. White people in this country are indifferent to and ignorant of the way this society treats people of color. Let's not pretend that Israel is some unique form of evil in the world. They are us and we are them. And the other thing, too, that's easy to forget. When I was a small child, my next door neighbor had a number tattooed on his arm. I don't remember learning what that number was, which means I don't remember ever not knowing what that number was.
It was always taught to you.
It was like came in with my mother's milk. and it came in through, there's a new science, epigenetics, that trauma of that kind of persecution is actually modifies your genes and is passed down generation to generation to generation. So I could see how October 7th was a moment for Israeli Jews where it felt like the floor, the ground was opening up beneath them. Now, I had an experience recently. I was talking with friends. I don't even remember what about, but for some reason it prompted the thought in me, even though I am opposed to the existence of a Jewish state, as I'm opposed to the existence of a Christian state or Muslim state or whatever, but I'm opposed to the existence of a Jewish state. I'm opposed to the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. The thought occurred to me, what if there were no Jewish state? And when that thought occurred, I experienced bottomless, existential fear. It was like, it was an instant, but it was there. It was there. Or I should say, it's always there, but I became aware of it. But there is a choice. I can live in that fear, or I can work to make a world in which that fear doesn't have to become a reality.
I really appreciate you taking the time for this conversation. This isn't an easy one, and I mean, I was hoping to have this for the purpose of, I think, understanding how to approach this conversation a bit better. And I haven't ever spoken to someone with both your background, your beliefs, but also kind of where you think we need to go moving forward. And I really appreciate you taking the time today to come and talk to our viewers about your own experiences and some of the thoughts that you've had in building that over time. Thank you for talking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And just for everyone who wants to learn more, you're Alan with the Jewish Voice for Peace, and they can find your writings online. And your last name for them to look that up?
Wagman, W-A-G-M-A-N.
Alan Wagman.
And if anybody's interested in my spiritual approach, I lead services at Nahalat Shalom the fourth Saturday of every month, and you do not have to be Jewish. I make it accessible to anybody.
Thank you. I'd like to come sometime. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Right.
All right. Thank you.